Now that you've got a basic idea of what a flow is, I would suggest that you go ahead and try to flow out your very first speech. If you've never flowed a speech before, don't worry about it. You're probably not going to be super good at it your first time, but I'm going to go really nice and slow during this first speech. Before you get started, a couple of things that you'll need is that you will need two pieces of paper, and you should draw a line on the left-hand side of the paper about 1.5 inches from the edge. It doesn't have to be perfectly straight. It's perfectly fine if it's not. But as I read this case, you're going to want to make sure that you keep all of the information inside of that line. Don't let it spill over to the next area. Just try to keep it in that space. The reason is that you want plenty of space to put all of the other arguments that are going to happen throughout the rest of the debate. Second of all, my suggestion is that you make sure you leave plenty of space between them vertically. And so, for example, the first piece of paper is going to be all of the stuff that I talk about when I say contention 1. There are two subpoints there. There's subpoint A and subpoint B. But I would make sure that you write subpoint A at the top, skip a couple of inches, do subpoint B, skip a couple of inches if there's future subpoint C or D or whatever. When I get to contention 2, it means grab a different sheet of paper and start writing on the top of that. Like I said, most people, their first attempt at doing this are not going to be super good at it, and that's perfectly acceptable. But what I want you to focus on is I want you to try to focus on getting better. At the end, I'll show you literally, I'm going to go through this video flowing it myself so that you can see my flow as I'm going, and then that way you can see how you did compared to how I did. Okay? With that said, we'll go ahead and get started. This is an 8-minute speech because it is an example of a high school policy debate. First affirmative constructive. I will later do an example of a college NFALD policy constructive, which is 6 minutes, but the high school one is 8 minutes long, and I'm going to do it pretty slowly. So you'll only need 2 sheets of paper, one for each contention. And this one is for the 2019-2020 high school policy debate topic, which is about the United States reducing arms sales. So if you aren't familiar with that, then there might be some terminology. But remember that sometimes when you're flowing, you're very familiar with the topic, and sometimes you may not be. Okay? With that said, I've got my timer set for 8 minutes, and we'll go ahead and get started. By the way, this is an example also of how to read a 1AC, although normally you'd be standing up. But you would start off by asking if everybody is ready. Is there anybody who doesn't have their flow paper ready? Because you want to make sure that the judge is ready to flow. All right? With that said, we'll begin. We begin the debate in contention 1, which is inherency, or the flaw of the status quo. Subpoint A is the United States passed the Child Soldier Prevention Act, or CSPA, in 2008 to prohibit the sale of arms to countries that use child soldiers. However, a widely used waiver allows sales to continue. This undermines any efforts the U.S. has to stop child soldiers. Stoll explains this in 2018, noting that in what is becoming a yearly disappointment, the Trump administration again missed a key opportunity to encourage foreign governments to stop recruiting and using child soldiers when President Trump released his determinations with respect to the Child Soldier Prevention Act of 2008. He declared that it is in the national interest of the United States to provide U.S. military assistance to 7 countries known to recruit or use or support the recruitment or use of children in armed conflict. In doing so, the Trump administration chose to overlook notable human rights concerns and undermine U.S. efforts to prevent the use of child soldiers. Congress passed the CSPA with the goal of leveraging U.S. arm transfers and military assistance to dissuade foreign governments from recruiting and using children in their national militaries or government-sponsored arms groups. The CSPA requires the Secretary of State to identify countries that recruit and use child soldiers. Once listed, those governments are prohibited from receiving direct commercial sales. And note subpoint B, that unfortunately the waivers have been used to justify significant amounts of arms sales to countries that exploit child soldiers. Stoll explains this in 2017, noting that the Trump administration waived CSPA provisions for 5 of the 8 countries identified on the State Department's child soldier list. In doing so, Trump effectively gave a pass to the governments that routinely exploit children in their national militaries or government-supported arms groups. Unfortunately, the Trump administration's failure to take a stand against the abusers of children is not unique. During the Obama administration, the United States routinely waived the CSPA's prohibition and authorized more than $315 million in arms sales to countries with known human rights abuses against children in armed conflict. The Obama administration withheld approximately $8 million in arms sales, amounting to roughly 2.6% of the total amount of arms sales. With this year's waiver, the Trump administration has continued a familiar pattern, authorizing 99% of U.S. military assistance that would have otherwise been prohibited by the CSPA. Because of the failure of the current system, we would like to offer the following plan. The United States federal government, specifically Congress, should amend Section 404A of the Child Soldier Prevention Act to remove the ability of the President to waive prohibition of countries listed by the Secretary of State as recruiting, using, or training child soldiers for the purpose of arms sales, including direct commercial sales from the United States. Additionally, actions such as recruiting or training children for police forces will be considered reason for the Secretary of State to determine that a country should be listed in the CSPA. No funding and enforcement will be needed for the plan. We reserve the right to clarify and cross-examination. Contention 2 is child soldiers. Subpoint A is there are hundreds of thousands of child soldiers. They are forced into suicide missions and sex slavery. Briggs explains in 2017 that as many as 300,000 children are believed to be serving as soldiers in armed conflicts around the world, depriving them of a normal childhood and education. These boys and girls, some as young as 7, serve in government forces and armed opposition groups. They fight on the front lines, participate in suicide missions, and act as spies. Girls are often forced into sexual slavery. Many are abducted or recruited by force, while others join out of desperation, believing these armed groups offer their best chance for survival. And subpoint B says, the recruitment and use of child soldiers is a flagrant violation of human rights and guarantees more and longer wars. Singer explains this in 2006, stating that the result is that war in the 21st century is not only more prevalent but more tragic. With children's involvement, warlords and terrorists and rebel leaders alike are finding that conflicts are easier to start. In turn, with such leaders being able to tap a new source of military labor, wars are harder to end. Rather than coming to a conclusion, they drag on, consuming not only societies in general, but also the childhood of literally hundreds of thousands of children. The recruitment and employment of child soldiers is one of the most flagrant violations of international human norms. And subpoint C, child soldier recruitment kills more than wars or terrorism. Akervina in 2006 notes that child soldiering does not assume centrality on the West security agenda, whose top priorities are terrorism, nuclear proliferation, and weapons of mass destruction. Child soldier recruitment is important because it involves the suffering and death of thousands of children every year, many more than are direct victims of terrorism or the use of weapons of mass destruction. Concerns about the immorality of their recruitment and transgressions of the rules of war might be regarded as self-evident, but to this consideration can be added several others, including heightened exposure of naive children to the risk of death or injuries in combat. It has long been understood that socialization into violence in youth creates a generation of violent adults, perpetuating the vicious cycle of instability within countries. Prevention is vital and less costly. And subpoint D says that waivers for the CSPA should be removed, and all countries that are found using child soldiers, including for police force, should be listed in the CSPA. As long as the waivers happen, the U.S. is complicit in the continuation of child soldiers. Hogg explains in 2016 that the CSPA should be fairly straightforward. The law bans the United States from providing military assistance or arms sales to governments that use children in combat. Except a loophole called the National Interest Waiver allows the president to bypass the law if it's deemed in the U.S. national interest to do so. Countries on this list have been denied only a smattering of military support. In many cases, military arms were provided to countries identified by the United States as using child soldiers. In complex conflicts, children are often more likely to be recruited and used by the police than by the military because in these countries, recruitment is typically more localized. The U.S. government's failure to apply the CSPA uniformly and consistently detracts from its commitment to protect the rights of children globally. Ultimately, no amount of national interest should stand in the way of pressuring abusive governments to end grave violations against children, including war crimes. By not listing all forces that egregiously violate children's rights, the United States is sending a message that abuse can be justified under certain circumstances. And we finished the affirmative constructive with subpoint E. Using the CSPA is effective. In 2012, the U.S. was able to get the Democratic Republic of Congo to change its child soldiers in 5 days and has achieved significant and verifiable results. Becker and 15. The administration in 2012 announced that it would withhold military financing from the Democratic Republic of Congo and training from a Congolese battalion until Congo signed into action plan with the United Nations to end its use of child soldiers. Congo had been dragging its feet for 7 years on signing the plan, but agreed to its terms only 5 days after the U.S. announcement. Last year, the United Nations documented only 2 cases of child recruitment by the Congo National Army, a significant change. Ending the use of child soldiers and maintaining critical mission alliance are not mutually exclusive goals. In Congo, withholding just a portion of authorized assistance was enough to prompt significant action. In too many cases, however, the United States provides military assistance to governments using child soldiers with no strings attached. The CSPA gives a powerful tool to let the U.S. military aid recipients know the use of child soldiers is unacceptable. It's for these reasons that I ask you to vote affirmative. And there was the timer. So let's see how you did. What I'd like you to do is look at your flow, and I'm going to show you my flow here in just a second. And I would encourage you in the next video to look at the flow. We'll kind of compare and contrast how you did and see if there's any questions. Also, there will be the example flow, so you can kind of compare and contrast it if there's any questions. If you have any questions, make sure you send me an email. Thanks.